We're looking at for loops in Java. We're going to look at a few examples of for loops, starting off with some really easy ones and then getting slightly harder as we go. Let's start out with a really basic for loop. We're just going to write for and then a set of parentheses and a set of braces. And inside of the parentheses, we're going to put three things. The first thing we're going to put is the variable that we're going to use for the for loop. So let's use an integer variable. We'll say int I equals 0. So this is just saying that we're going to use the integer I for the for loop, and we want it to start at 0. Next, we put how long we want the for loop to keep going for. So I'm going to say I is less than 10. So the for loop will keep going if I is still less than 10. And then we're going to say I plus plus, which just means increase the value of I by 1. It's called incrementing I. And after I plus plus, note that there is no semicolon. So there's a semicolon after our first statement inside of it, and a semicolon after our loop continuation condition, but no semicolon after the I plus plus. Inside of the for loop, let's just say system.out.println, and then we'll print the value of I. So if we run this, we'll get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this is a really basic for loop. We just say which variable we're going to be using for the loop, where we want it to start at, how long we want the loop to keep going for, and how much we want the value of our variable to change after every pass of the loop. And there's lots of other things we could put in our loop continuation condition. We put I is less than 10. We can put anything in here that's going to evaluate to true or false. So I is less than 10 will evaluate to true as long as I is less than 10, and then it evaluates to false once I is not less than 10. We could put something like I is greater than 10 or I equals 10, indicated with a double equal sign. Although if we ran it like this right now, then the loop wouldn't even run one time because I is 0 to start with, and the loop is only going to run if I equals 10. We could also put something like I is less than or equal to 10. So this would just run one more time than it ran last time, since before we had while I is less than 10, but this time it would run an extra time while I equals 10. Let's write out another for loop now. Let's go for int j equals 100 as long as j is greater than or equal to 0. J equals j minus 10. And then a set of braces for the body of our loop. So we have our integer variable j starting at 100, and the loop's going to keep going as long as j is greater than or equal to 0. And after every pass of the loop, then j is going to decrease by 10. And let's put another print statement inside of our for loop. Let's say system.out.println, and then inside of quotation marks, we'll put j is, and outside of the quotation marks, we'll put the value of j. So when we run this right now, it's going to start at 100, and then it's going to count down by 10 all the way until j hits 0. Let's make another one now. Let's make a variable called numDogs, and we'll set that to 11 to start with, and we're going to use it inside of our for loop. And then we'll go int numDogs fed, and we'll start that off at 0. In our for loop, let's say for numDogs fed equals 0, and then the loop is going to keep going as long as numDogs fed is less than or equal to the number of dogs. So the loop's going to keep going, and it's going to feed all of the dogs. And for every pass of the loop, let's say numDogs fed plus plus. So for every pass, we'll feed one dog. And let's put a print statement inside of our loop. Let's say system.out.println numDogs fed plus dogs have been fed. So that's how many dogs have been fed, and then we are going to print out how many dogs still need to be fed. So we'll put a second set of parentheses inside of our first set. We'll say numDogs minus numDogs fed. So the total number of dogs subtract the number of dogs that have already been fed, and then we'll go plus still need to be fed. So if we run this right now, then it will start at 0 dogs having been fed and 11 still needing to be fed. And then it'll just work its way all the way down until all of the dogs are fed. A really common use of for loops is to use them with arrays and array lists. Let's use them with an array right now. For anyone brand new to Java, an array is just a variable that is a list of variables. So if we say int array, indicated by square brackets, array1 equals, and then a set of braces and a semicolon, then our array1 is a list of integer variables. And our list can go inside of our braces. So we can go 1, 5, 6, and just fill it with random numbers. And now we're going to print out these numbers inside of a for loop. Each element in an array is just accessed using the array name. So we go array1, and then a set of brackets. And inside of the brackets, we put which element we want to access. And the elements in an array are listed starting at 0. So this is the 0th element, number 1 here. And then element 1 is number 5. So if we want to access the 1, then we just put array1 and then 0 inside of square brackets. So to set the first element to something else, we could just go array1 0 equals 100. So now the number 1 in here is actually 100. And to print out our array inside of a for loop, we can just go for int I equals 0, as long as I is less than array1 dot length. Length is just a really handy attribute that arrays have that lets you know how long the array is. So we go while I is less than array1 dot length, I plus plus. And then inside of our loop, we will just print out the value of the ith index in our array. So we'll go array1 square brackets I. So on the first pass through the loop, I is going to be 0. So the 0th element of array1 will print out, which we set to 100. And then I increases by 1 after that pass. So on the second pass, we're going to get the value 5 printed out because that's element number 1 in our array. And then it'll just keep going and print out the entire array for us. We could have said while I is less than 8. And this would give us the same thing since we have 8 elements in our array. It's just not quite as flexible because later on we might decide that we actually want this array to be longer and we might put some more elements in. So it's a lot more flexible if we just say array1 dot length. That way it'll just adjust automatically if we end up putting more elements in or taking out elements. So if we run this right now, then we'll get our entire array printing out. We have 9 elements starting at 100 and then ending with 11. So we printed out the elements of an array with a for loop, and the array we used was a 1-dimensional array. Let's do something more fun. Let's make a 2-dimensional array and then print out those values inside of a for loop. 2D arrays are just arrays of arrays. So say you had something like int array player goals, and this array was just tracking the number of goals that players on a team have. And then say you had another array called player assists that just tracks their assists. Then instead of writing this out as 2 separate arrays, it's a lot more convenient if we can just link them together. And to do that, we use 2-dimensional arrays, which make it a lot easier to do stuff to these values. So if we wanted to sort these values, or we wanted to search something up, or we wanted to delete one of these values, then using 1D arrays, anything we did to one of the arrays, we would then have to do to the other array. So we would have to make sure that we exactly matched whatever we do to one to the other one. Because right now the player with 0 goals has 1 assist, the player with 2 goals has 3 assists, the player with 3 goals, 4 assists, and the player with 4 goals has 3 assists. So if we wanted to sort the players by the amount of assists that they have, then we couldn't just move the numbers in the assists array. We would also have to move the numbers in the goals array so that each element in the goals array is still aligned with its corresponding element in the assists array. So it's a lot easier using a 2D array. To use a 2D array, we can say int and then 2 sets of square brackets. The name of our array, we'll just call it players. And then we'll say equals new int and then 2 sets of square brackets ending with a semicolon. Inside of our square brackets, we indicate how long we want our array to be. So for our players example, we can go 4 by 2. That's 4 players, and for each player, we need to track their goals and assists, so that's 2 values. So players is an array of 4 arrays, 1 array for each player, and each of those arrays has 2 elements, 1 to track their goals and 1 to track their assists. And this is when for loops get fun. Let's write a for loop to fill up our array with values for each player. Let's go for int I equals 0, while I is less than players dot length I plus plus, and then our set of braces. Players dot length refers to how many arrays are inside of our players variable, and that number is 4. We made 4 arrays inside of our array players. And inside of this for loop, to fill up each of those 2 elements, we're going to make another for loop. We'll say for int j equals 0, while j is less than players I dot length j plus plus. So our outer for loop is for each player. There are 4 players, and for each of those players, this for loop is going to execute twice, since players I dot length will always be 2, because each of our 4 arrays are only 2 elements long. So inside of this inner for loop, we'll say players I j, and we'll just give each player 10 goals and 10 assists. So the first pass through the for loop, our values would be players 0 and 0, because I starts at 0 and j starts at 0. So the first pass through this inner for loop, it's executing on players 0, 0, and it would just set that to 10, which would give our player 10 goals. And then it would run through this inner for loop again, since it's going to run through it twice every time. And on the second time through, it would go players 0, because I is still 0, and j will be 1, because we're on our second pass through this inner for loop. So this is setting the assists, and it would set them to 10. After that, j would increase to 2, which is not less than the length, since the length is 2. So then this inner for loop would exit, and the execution would go back to this top for loop. Our value of I would increase by 1, so I would now be 1. It would enter into the inner for loop, and this time I is 1. So it would set players 1, 0 to 10. So set the goals for player 1 to 10, and then set the assists for player 1 to 10. And then j increases to 2. So then this inner for loop exits because 2 is not less than 2. So the inner for loop's done. Now it goes back to the outer for loop, and the outer for loop would now be 2. So I is now 2, and then it enters into the inner for loop where j is 0. So it goes players 2, 0, setting the goals for player 2 to 10, and then setting the assists for player 2 to 10. And it would keep going for the rest of our players, however many we had. Let's print out the values for each of our players after the inner for loop executes, giving that player 10 goals and 10 assists. Let's say system.out.println player in quotations plus I plus has plus their amount of goals, which will be players I 0 plus quotation goals. And then let's print out their assists. Let's just copy and paste our print statement. So we have player I has players I 1 assists. So if we run this right now, then it'll just let us know that each of them has 10 goals and 10 assists. We still have that other for loop printing out below this. I'll just comment that out. And run this again. And there are all of our players, starting with player 0, and they each have 10 goals and 10 assists. To make it even more fun, we could actually give them each a random number of goals and assists. Let's get rid of these last 2 lines inside of our inner for loop, since they were just to show what was happening. And instead of players ij equals 10, we're going to use something called math.random to generate us a random number. We'll put a set of parentheses. Inside of the parentheses, we'll put int, and I'll explain what that's doing after. And then we're going to do a second set of parentheses, and we'll put math.random times 10. And this gives us a random value between 0 and 9. Math.random gives a random value between 0 and 0 points repeating 9. And then we're multiplying that by 10, which gives us a value between 0 and 9 points repeating 9. And the number that math.random gives us is a double, but we want to store an integer value for our goals and assists, since we can't have players with like 2.5 assists or 3.7 goals. So that's why we have our int in brackets here. This just converts our value from math.random times 10 into an integer value. And when it converts it, it's not going to round it, it's just going to drop the decimals. So after this step, we'll have a value between 0 and 9 without any decimals on it. So if we run this now, then each of our players has a random number of goals and assists between 0 and 9. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll put some resources in the description for anyone who's just starting to code. Just some links to some of my videos and some links to some really awesome Java books that will make your life like a million times easier as you're learning Java.